The dust hadn't even settled on the gravel road when 40 service trucks rolled onto Barnabas Aldridge's small farm in a single, thunderous line, and the 82-year-old rancher stood frozen on his porch, unable to understand why an entire fleet of strangers in matching uniforms had come looking for him 31 years after he'd sold the only prize bull he ever owned to save a boy nobody else wanted to help. Before we continue, if you believe in kindness and second chances, take a moment to like this video, drop a comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to Wisdom Storyhouse, because this story is about to remind you that a single act of sacrifice can echo across an entire lifetime. Barnabas was 51 years old back in that first autumn, running a modest cattle ranch on the edge of a small farming town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business and nobody had much to spare. He'd built the ranch up slowly over 2 decades since inheriting it from his own father, and his pride and joy was a magnificent bull named Solomon, a prize-winning animal he'd spent years breeding and training, worth more than nearly everything else he owned combined. Barnabas was a widower by then, his wife having passed from illness 6 years earlier, and he lived alone on that ranch with only the rhythm of daily chores and the company of his cattle to fill the silence his wife had left behind. That particular October, driving back from the feed store on a cold, overcast afternoon, Barnabas noticed a teenage boy sitting alone on an overturned crate outside the closed gas station at the edge of town, wearing a threadbare jacket entirely inadequate for the dropping temperature, his few possessions gathered into a torn duffel bag beside him. Barnabas recognized something in the boy's posture immediately, the particular stillness of someone who had nowhere left to go and had stopped expecting anyone to notice. He pulled his truck over, rolled down the window, and asked the boy directly whether he had a place to sleep that night. The boy's name was Thaddeus Winslow, 16 years old, who had aged out of the foster system's temporary placements after his last group home shut down due to funding cuts, leaving him with no family willing to take him in and no stable address to his name. He'd been sleeping in whatever shelter he could find for nearly 3 weeks, surviving on odd jobs and the occasional kindness of strangers who rarely followed through on promises to help further. Thaddeus answered Barnabas's question honestly, expecting the old rancher to simply drive away as most people did once they'd satisfied their curiosity. Instead, Barnabas told him to climb into the truck. He brought Thaddeus back to the ranch that evening, fed him a proper meal for the first time in weeks, and offered him the small guest room that had sat unused since his wife's death. No strings attached beyond an expectation of honest work around the property if the boy chose to stay. Thaddeus, wary but exhausted beyond arguing, accepted, and what began as a single night shelter slowly extended into weeks, then months, as Barnabas discovered in the boy a diligence and quiet intelligence that reminded him, in some ways, of the son he and his late wife had never been able to have. The trouble arrived that winter, when Thaddeus developed a severe respiratory infection that worsened rapidly due to weeks of prior exposure and malnutrition before Barnabas had found him. The local clinic, seeing that Thaddeus had no legal guardian and no insurance of any kind, initially refused to admit him for anything beyond basic emergency stabilization, informing Barnabas that specialized treatment at the regional hospital would require payment upfront that neither Barnabas nor the boy could possibly produce. Barnabas sat in that clinic's waiting room that night, watching Thaddeus's condition worsen through a cracked doorway, understanding with growing certainty that without immediate, serious medical intervention, the boy he'd taken in only months earlier might not survive the week. Barnabas made the decision without much deliberation, though it was, by any practical measure, one of the hardest choices of his life. He drove home that same night, and the following morning, contacted a livestock broker he'd worked with for years, arranging to sell Solomon, his prize bull, the single most valuable asset he owned, for whatever price could be finalized within 24 hours. The broker, recognizing the urgency in Barnabas's voice, managed to arrange a buyer within the day, and by that evening, Barnabas had enough cash in hand to cover Thaddeus's emergency transfer and treatment at the regional hospital, watching the truck haul Solomon away down the same gravel road he'd walked countless times, without allowing himself a single moment of visible regret in front of the boy he was trying to save. Thaddeus recovered slowly over the following weeks, and when he finally understood what Barnabas had sacrificed to make his treatment possible, he broke down entirely, insisting he wasn't worth an animal that had taken years to breed and train, that Barnabas should never have given up something so valuable for a stranger with nothing to offer in return. Barnabas, sitting beside the boy's hospital bed, told him simply that animals could always be replaced given enough time and effort, but a life, once lost, could never be recovered by any amount of money or patience, and that he'd rather spend his remaining years poorer in cattle than wealthy in regret. If this story is touching your heart right now, please take a moment to like this video and leave a comment sharing your thoughts, because what happens next reminds us that the smallest sacrifices sometimes plant seeds we never live to see fully bloom. Thaddeus stayed with Barnabas for nearly 4 more years, finishing high school through a local program while working the ranch alongside the old rancher, slowly rebuilding the herd that Solomon's sale had diminished, learning every aspect of running a small agricultural operation with a dedication that surprised even Barnabas himself. When Thaddeus turned 20, restless with an ambition Barnabas had always quietly encouraged, he left the ranch to pursue vocational training in diesel mechanics and heavy equipment repair, a field he developed a genuine passion for while helping maintain the ranch's aging machinery over those formative years. Barnabas saw him off with pride rather than sorrow, understanding that raising someone well sometimes meant watching them build a life beyond the boundaries of your own. Thaddeus's career took him further than either of them could have predicted during those early years on the ranch. He excelled in his training, worked his way up through increasingly specialized positions in commercial fleet maintenance, and eventually, after nearly 2 decades of steady advancement, founded his own company, Winslow Fleet Services, specializing in emergency roadside assistance and maintenance contracts for commercial and agricultural vehicles across 3 states. He never forgot the ranch or the man who had given up everything valuable he owned for a stranger's survival, visiting Barnabas whenever his increasingly demanding schedule allowed, though those visits, admittedly, grew less frequent as his company's rapid growth consumed more and more of his time. Barnabas, now 82, had continued running his modest ranch alone for years, his herd never quite recovering to its former size, his body slowing considerably with age, though his stubborn independence kept him from asking anyone for help he hadn't specifically been offered. What Barnabas didn't know, standing on his porch that particular morning as 40 service trucks rolled in formation up his gravel driveway, was that Thaddeus, learning through a mutual acquaintance that Barnabas's ranch had fallen into serious disrepair after a series of health issues the old man had never mentioned to anyone, had spent the previous month quietly organizing something considerably larger than a simple personal visit. Before this story ends, if it moved you even a little, please comment the word sacrifice below, because sometimes the debts we never expect to be repaid find their way back to us in the most overwhelming and unexpected ways imaginable. Thaddeus stepped out of the lead truck, now a broad-shouldered man of 47, and walked directly to Barnabas standing stunned on his porch, embracing the old rancher who had once given up everything he valued for a stranger with nothing to offer in return. He explained, as the remaining 39 trucks and their uniformed crews began fanning out methodically across the property, that he had mobilized his entire company's regional workforce for a single weekend, at his own expense, to completely restore Barnabas's ranch, repairing fences that had fallen into disrepair, servicing decades-old farm equipment that hadn't run properly in years, rebuilding the barn's collapsing roof, and, most significantly, delivering and unloading an entirely new herd of prize cattle, handpicked and purchased by Thaddeus himself over the preceding weeks, to replace what Solomon's sale had cost the old man 31 years earlier. Barnabas stood in the middle of his own driveway, surrounded by the organized chaos of dozens of workers restoring his life's work in real time, utterly overwhelmed by the scale of what was unfolding in front of him. He tried, several times, to protest that this was far too much, that he'd never expected anything in return for what he'd done all those years ago, that the sacrifice had never been made with repayment in mind. Thaddeus, standing beside him watching his crew's work, told him plainly that he understood that completely, that this wasn't repayment in the transactional sense Barnabas seemed to fear, but simply the natural continuation of a debt that had been quietly accumulating interest in his heart for 31 years, one he'd finally accumulated the means to properly honor. By the end of that single, extraordinary weekend, Barnabas's ranch stood restored beyond anything it had looked like even in its most prosperous years decades earlier, populated by a new herd grazing contentedly across freshly repaired pastures, its buildings sturdy and weatherproofed against the years still ahead. Thaddeus stayed those final 2 days himself, working alongside his crews, sharing meals with Barnabas on the porch each evening exactly as they once had during those formative years so long ago, the conversation between them settling into the same easy comfort neither man had fully realized how much he'd missed. Barnabas Aldridge lived another 6 years after that transformative weekend, his ranch thriving under the renewed strength Thaddeus had provided, his final years surrounded by a herd that carried forward the legacy Solomon's sacrifice had once nearly ended entirely. Thaddeus visited regularly for the remainder of Barnabas's life, no longer constrained by the excuse of a demanding schedule, having rearranged his own priorities permanently after that weekend reminded him precisely what mattered most. When Barnabas finally passed peacefully in his sleep at 88 years old, it was Thaddeus who organized the funeral, Thaddeus who delivered the eulogy describing a man who had taught him that true wealth was measured not in cattle or currency but in the willingness to give everything you had for someone the rest of the world had already given up on. What began with the sale of a single prize bull to save one forgotten teenager became, over 31 years, proof that genuine kindness, however small it might seem in the moment, has a way of returning to us multiplied beyond anything we could have imagined when we first chose to give it freely.